welcome back to the LitGam channel, where today I will be covering the Legend of Zelda series, which has seen multiple changes throughout its history, with each entry including various systems and mechanics that remain relatively unique to their respective entries. This can be seen in cases such as in The Wind Waker, with the introduction of sea traversal, and Twilight Princess with Wolf Link, I guess. However, the most drastic changes to the series' traditional linear dungeon-based designs was introduced in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild in 2017. We sought to transition the series to a more free-flowing and open structure to much critical acclaim. This title placed greater emphasis on player freedom, and how they themselves tackle the game can be seen in almost every aspect of Breath of the Wild, such as in its freeform climbing mechanics, and even the ability to defeat the final boss after completing the tutorial, with this emphasis on freedom being expanded upon greatly in the sequel, Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Now, both games do approach the tutorial sections in a similar way, with Breath of the Wild's Great Plateau and Tears of the Kingdom's Great Sky Island, with both being expansive and diverse playgrounds for the developers to introduce the mechanics of the game before allowing the player to explore the larger map. Despite this being a fine way of providing a tutorial for the player, I believe that both games exhibit both pros and cons in their executions. This can be attributed to three factors: its length, player engagement and structure, with each contributing to the overall effectiveness of the tutorial. So today I'm going to be running through both games and trying to determine which game is the best introduction in my non-gaming designer opinion. Let's do this. To start off with, length is probably the most crucial element of any tutorial, as a tutorial is mainly positioned as a required prelude to the wider game in teaching the player required mechanics, making a long and sluggish tutorial tending to be boring and disengaging to the player before they've even experienced the main experience of the game. This is where I believe the Great Plateau greatly outclasses the Sky Islands, in that it provides relatively the same information in a more succinct and engaging format. To illustrate this, I ran through both tutorial sections using intended mechanics, not trying to speedrun, with each coming out to 1 hour and 7 minutes for Breath of the Wild, and for Tears of the Kingdom coming in at 1 hour and 30 minutes. As can be seen, Breath of the Wild comes in at a significantly shorter time to complete its tutorial, which might not be seen as bad, but considering that this is without engaging in many of the enemy engagements and general exploration found within it, the first playthrough could have tended to be a lot longer than this 1 hour and 7 minutes. I can honestly say that my first playthrough of the opening of Tears of the Kingdom took me around 5 hours to complete and felt dragging in comparison to Breath of the Wild, making Breath of the Wild the winner in terms of a shorter tutorial. However, short length in itself does not determine the success of a tutorial. It's more so how and what the developer decides to specifically point out to the player in the form of text boxes and overt prompts, and what they instead decide to allow the player to discover through their own experimentation. Now, for certain concepts like the Ultra Hand in Tears of the Kingdom, the developer obviously needs to introduce the mechanic to the player initially, but they should also be allowed to experiment with the ability with minimal developer interference in order to establish both the rules of the game world and how they can be utilised by the player in a creative context. This closer form of tutorialisation can be seen in Tears of the Kingdom in the introduction of the Zonai and Ultra Hand mechanics in their respective shrines, with the developers placing these components around the Sky Islands freely in order to encourage experimentation, with such a section being highlighted in the initial gameplay reveal of Tears of the Kingdom. However, Tears of the Kingdom also suffers from an intense presence of over-explanations through its introductory shrines, explaining basic movement and combat features that the player would have already have grasped to make it to the point in the tutorial. Breath of the Wild, on the other hand, relies sparingly on tutorialisation in general, such that the primary abilities are introduced once within its respective shrines, with the developers allowing the players to experiment naturally without being overly pestered by tutorials. Granted, Breath of the Wild's abilities are mainly focused on affecting the environment rather than the traversal focus of Tears of the Kingdom's abilities, making Tears of the Kingdom's focus on providing materials for the player's own experimentation more important within that game rather than Breath of the Wild. However, in comparing both games, I have to give the point to Breath of the Wild due to only teaching the player the required information instead of bombarding them as in Tears of the Kingdom. Finally, the biggest difference between the Great Plateau and the Sky Island is their structure and design, with Sky Islands being a drawn out slog in comparison to the Plateau. Now, don't get me wrong, the Sky Island features a way more vertical landscape for the player to explore in comparison to the Plateau, featuring many separate floating island caves which are representative of the main addition of Tears of the Kingdom, being the introduction of the underground and Sky Islands to Hyrule. However, despite the increase in verticality, I believe the Plateau is both more compact and identifiable, both in its smaller scale, with there always being points of interest interesting view of the player, which encourages natural curiosity and exploration, whereas the player can often find themselves lost within Sky Islands due to the lack of perceivable landmarks during the majority of player experience. Breath of the Wild's world design draws the player's attention naturally, rather than in Tears of the Kingdom, which relies on constant waypoints and direction from the developer. This can largely be seen in the structuring of the area themselves, which I will break down into guided and freeform sections, as is displayed by this amazingly drawn graph. As despite both games being largely non-linear in structure, the developers still require the player to have achieved certain goals and objectives before they are released into the game world proper. When looking at the Great Plateau, it starts us off in the Shrine of Resurrection, where Link is directed out to this beautiful cutscene of Hyrule. He's then prompted to talk to the old man and is directed towards the Temple of Time, wherein he's disrupted by Zelda, who instead gives him the location of the tower, which is marked on the waypoint. Once raising the tower, a short cutscene plays that gives a vision of the castle by Zelda, establishing the eventual goal of the game. After this, the old man confronts Link and directs him to the Oma-O shrine. That's a terrible pronunciation, but the Magnesis ability is introduced. After the shrine, the old man explains the existence of the Sheikah and 3 other shrines on the plateau, where he also introduces fast travel and the importance of observing the environment from high places. He also introduces the scope and pin system within the game. After this point, the player is given free reign to complete whichever shrine they desire. After the completion of the final shrine, the player is directed back to the Temple of Time to be taught about the Spirit Orbs and receiving the Paraglider. The player is given a riddle instead about where the old man will be, waiting where the shrines intersect, which turns out to be the Temple of Time. Then the player is allowed to enter Hyrule proper, bringing it to the end of the tutorial. In comparison, Tears of the Kingdom, the game begins under Hyrule Castle and establishes Ganon, the main antagonist of the game, where the player is given basic tips on how to swing a sword and is given basic enemies to fight. After the confrontation with Ganon, they wake up in Sky Island, wherein they fall and are given the principles of diving and how to negate fall damage with water. However, unlike Breath of the Wild with the old man, they are not given clear direction by the game, but walking forward will eventually lead to the interaction with the Zonai construct, who gives you the Pura Pad. Through this, the player is given a waypoint to the floating Temple of Time to find Zelda. After making it to the Temple of Time, Rauru tells you must restore arm energy through visiting shrines, much like Breath of the Wild. The first shrine gives you the Ultra Hand ability, akin to the Magnesis ability in the first game. The rotate symbol is given a subtle golden colouring to draw the player's attention, which is actually an improvement over the Breath of the Wild system. After this, they are told by Rauru to locate other shrines and place pins on the Pura Pad, wherein he will continue to provide lore to the player throughout the overworld. Through the journey to the other shrines, the player will come into contact with other Zonai constructs that will teach the player about destructible environments such as tree chopping and bow combat, plus other mechanics such as crouching and how this integrates into other mechanics such as hunting. The game also teaches you about cooking, however this can also be seen as quite overwhelming to the player, and some of the mechanics they include are Zonai devices, caves, Zonai batteries, Zonai processing, Zonai charges, energy cells, Zonai capsules, processing, Zonai dispensaries, energy wells. Yeah, as you can see, it's very overwhelming in comparison to Breath of the Wild. There is also an abundance of environmental puzzles to teach the player about winds, such as the shipbuilding puzzle, and players are also able to engage with the shrines in whichever order they wish, just like Breath of the Wild. After completing the final shrine, they are told to go back to the Temple of Time, in which they will receive the Recall ability. The player is required to participate in a Recall puzzle to teach the ability player, which I'm sure will never be repeated again and again and again. However, they are stopped by a huge door due to lack of health, and told to seek out another shrine on the island, wherein fast travel is finally unlocked. This is the main problem, I believe, in the Tears of the Kingdom tutorial. It brings you to an anticlimax wherein the player is expecting to be let loose onto the world of Hyrule, but is instead recalled to another menial shrine task. However, to unlock the final shrine, you are required to use the abilities you've learned up to this point, which does make a good sort of use of the challenge, but it is overly bloated, I believe. After that, you need to make your way back to the temple and complete the exact same puzzle again to get to a statue wherein you attain a heart container. As you can see, both games adapt the same general structure to fit their respective games' focus, with Breath of the Wild placing more emphasis on ground traversal and thereby having a much flatter landscape with more distinctive landmarks, whereas Tears of the Kingdom has a more vertically focused and expansive tutorial area. However, I believe where Breath of the Wild feels concise and Tears of the Kingdom feels just a bit monotonous and anticlimactic due to its extended length and constant tutorialization. Due to this, I believe that Breath of the Wild holds a more comprehensive and overall enjoyable introduction to the world of Hyrule, making it a superior tutorial. Well, that's it for this analysis. Be sure to like and subscribe as it really helps me out. See you in the next video.